Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going down a pretty dark road exploring the life and crimes of Tommy Lynn Sells, the so-called coast-to-coast killer.
Yeah.
We're sticking to court documents and Wikipedia as our main source material.
Okay.
So, we're sticking to the facts here as much as possible, which in this case is especially important because there's a lot we just don't know.
Yeah, that's right. Sells claimed to have killed over 70 people, but only 22 murders were officially confirmed by the police.
Wow.
So right off the bat, you have this chilling ambiguity
Right.
hanging over the whole case.
It's almost like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but with like half the pieces missing or something like that.
Right.
So where do we even begin with a guy like this?
Well, like with a lot of cases of extreme violence, his early life might provide some clues.
Okay.
It's often a really complex mix of nature and nurture, that shapes people who are capable of such horrific acts.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, okay, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
What was his childhood like?
Well, to say it was rough would be a serious understatement.
Yeah.
He was born into poverty in Oakland, California, and he lost his twin sister to meningitis when they were just 18 months old.
Oh, wow.
So imagine the impact of a loss like that at such a young age.
Yeah, that's hard to even fathom.
Yeah.
And it sounds like things didn't get much better for him from there.
No, they really didn't. He was shuffled back and forth between relatives, and he eventually ended up back with his mother,
Okay.
who, according to Sells, essentially allowed him to be abused by a family friend,
Wow.
starting at just 7 years old.
Oh, my gosh. It just makes you wonder how anyone could come out of that kind of environment, emotionally unscathed,
Yeah, it's almost impossible. And, this is something that we see a lot with violent offenders.
right?
This severe childhood trauma, it can have such a profound impact on a person's development and their ability to form, healthy relationships.
And Nethers actually claimed that he was reliving, these traumatic experiences when he committed his crimes.
Right.
It was almost like this horrible cycle of abuse and violence that he just couldn't escape.
Yeah, and that's a really disturbing detail that points to a potential link between his early abuse and, his crimes later in life.
Right.
I mean, it's not a direct cause and effect relationship, of course,
Of course.
but it's definitely a significant piece of the puzzle.
So we have this deeply troubled childhood,
Right.
right? And then things escalate even further when he starts drinking at 7, using narcotics by 10.
Right.
And then he basically just becomes this nomad by 14,
Yeah.
hitchhiking and train hopping all across the country.
Exactly. That nomadic lifestyle combined with the substance abuse,
Right.
it paints a picture of someone who is really struggling to cope, disconnected from any sense of stability or belonging.
Yeah.
And it's during this period of time that his criminal activity really starts to surface.
I'm guessing that early criminal activity was just a precursor to the more violent crimes that he would eventually commit.
Unfortunately, yes, and one incident in 1992 really stands out as a turning point.
Okay.
It involves a woman named Fabienne Witherspoon in West Virginia.
Okay.
And she actually showed Sells some kindness by bringing him home and offering him food.
I have a feeling this doesn't end well.
Yeah, it didn't. While she was preparing the food, he broke into her house and attacked her.
Oh, wow.
It seems like his schizoid tendencies,
Yeah.
the difficulty he had in forming those genuine connections,
Yeah.
it seems like that may have played a role here.
Okay.
Witherspoon's act of kindness may have been completely misread by Sells. You know what I mean?
Right.
And this might have just fueled, his paranoia and rage.
That's a chilling thought.
It really is. And what's remarkable is that Witherspoon fought back with incredible ferocity.
Wow.
I mean, she used a ceramic duck and then a knife
Wow.
to defend herself, and she actually managed to seriously injure him,
Okay.
and she caused some lasting damage.
So she was able to escape.
She was, thankfully, but the attack was brutal, and it really highlights Sells' escalating violence,
Yeah.
So he was arrested, spent 5 years in prison, and this is actually where he was diagnosed with a whole range of psychological disorders.
What kind of diagnoses are we talking about here?
Well, he was diagnosed with a personality disorder,
Okay.
with antisocial, borderline, and schizoid features,
Wow.
along with substance abuse disorder, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, and psychosis.
Oh, my God.
So it's a laundry list of mental health challenges
Right.
that undoubtedly contributed to his violent tendencies.
Wow. So we're not just dealing with garden variety criminal behavior here.
Right.
This is a deeply troubled individual with a very complex psychological profile.
Exactly. And while that diagnosis doesn't excuse his actions,
Right.
it does provide some context
Right.
for understanding the forces that were at play within him. And what's particularly disturbing is that this attack on Witherspoon and her, really fierce resistance, it may have actually been a catalyst for him.
Oh, wow.
It's almost as if experiencing that level of defiance just fueled his rage
Right.
and made him even more determined to exert power and control over his victims.
That's terrifying.
It is.
So after he's released from prison in 1997,
Yeah.
is that when he really earns that coast-to-coast killer moniker?
Yes, he starts drifting across the country again and leaves this trail of violence behind him.
Right.
And remember, he claims to have killed over 70 people.
Right.
But the police were only able to confirm 22 murders.
Right.
So you have this chilling ambiguity, right from the start.
Yeah.
This gap between what he confessed to and what they were actually able to confirm.
Yeah, so let's delve into some of those confirmed cases a little bit more.
Okay.
How about we start with the 1985 murders of Ina and Rory Cord in Missouri?
Yeah, that's a particularly brutal case.
Okay.
That really demonstrates the depths of his violence.
Okay.
He met Ina at a carnival.
Okay.
And she invited him back to her home.
That sounds eerily familiar.
It does, doesn't it?
Another act of kindness that seriously backfired.
Yeah, and this time the consequences were fatal. He beat Ina to death with a baseball bat, and then he killed her 4-year-old son, Rory, claiming that he was a potential witness.
Wow, that's just pure evil.
Yeah.
It's almost beyond comprehension how someone could do that to a child.
It's a chilling example of his capacity for violence.
Yeah.
And his complete disregard for human life. And unfortunately, this was just the beginning of his cross-country killing spree,
Right.
This was just the start.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to imagine it gets worse. But then there's the case of Suzanne Korch in New York in 1987.
Yeah, this one is really frustrating. Kortz went missing from a nightclub.
Okay.
And they didn't find her body for 8 years.
Wow.
And when they did find her, she was so decomposed that they couldn't even figure out how she died.
Oh, wow. So how did they even connect Sells to the crime then?
Well, years later, while Sells was in prison for another murder,
Okay.
he actually confessed to killing a woman in Lockport around that time.
Huh.
He even identified Kortz from photos
Really?
and the crime scene, but they didn't prosecute him for her murder because he was already on death row.
Oh, wow. That must be so difficult for her family, knowing that her killer was already behind bars,
Right.
but never faced justice specifically for her death.
Absolutely. It just highlights those legal complexities when you're dealing with serial killers,
Right.
who have committed crimes in multiple states.
Yeah, and speaking of complex cases, that same year, 1987, Sells confessed to the murders of the Dardine family in Illinois.
Right.
And that case is just horrific because the sheer brutality
It is.
and the fact that children were involved.
It's one of the most disturbing cases I've ever come across.
Yeah.
Sells claims that he shot Keith Dardine, and then
Okay.
this is where it gets really gruesome. He claims that he emasculated Keith before shooting him again.
Oh, my gosh.
And then he bludgeoned Keith's 3-year-old son, Peter, to death.
It's hard to even listen to this.
It is.
And what about Keith's wife, Elaine?
Yeah.
She was pregnant at the time, right?
She was, and the beating that she endured caused her to go and labor.
Oh, wow.
She gave birth to a baby girl, but Sells killed her too.
I don't even have words.
It's truly horrific. However, there's something important to note here. While Sells confessed to this crime, his account actually has some discrepancies with some of the non-public details from the crime scene.
Really?
And because of Texas law, they couldn't extradite him to Illinois for further investigation.
So even though he confessed, there's still some doubt about his involvement.
There is, and it brings up a really interesting question. Why would someone confess to a crime, especially one this horrific, if they didn't commit it?
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. Is it about notoriety, do you think?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, serial killers, they often have this really complex relationship
Right.
with their crimes and their public image.
Right.
Some of them crave the spotlight,
Right.
while others might use confessions as a form of manipulation.
Okay.
They're trying to control the narrative even from behind bars.
It's like a twisted game to them.
It really is. And I'm guessing you're probably thinking that there are other instances where Sells' confessions were called into question.
Exactly.
Well, there are, for example, he confessed to the murder and dismemberment of a woman in Las Vegas.
Okay.
And he claimed that he buried her body near the Snake River, but they did extensive searches.
Wow.
And they couldn't find anything.
Right.
No evidence was ever found to support his claim.
So was he lying or was there just not enough evidence?
It's hard to say for sure.
Right.
But when you look at the pattern of his confessions, it does raise some red flags.
Right.
He also claimed to have killed a woman and her son in Idaho.
Okay.
But again, no evidence was ever found.
God, that makes you wonder how many of his 70 claimed victims were actually real.
It does, and I think that's one of the most unsettling aspects of this entire case,
Yeah, right.
We may never truly know the extent of his crimes.
Yeah, that's a thought that chills you to the bone.
It is.
knowing that there could be families out there
Right.
who will never get closure because their loved one's disappearance was never officially linked to Sells.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a really important point in the story, one that offers a glimmer of hope amidst all this darkness, the case of Crystal Searles.
Wait, Crystal Sells, that name sounds familiar.
It should. In December of 1999, Sells broke into a trailer in Del Rio, Texas,
Okay.
where he sexually assaulted and murdered 13-year-old Kayleen Harris.
Okay.
But he also attacked 10-year-old Crystal Searles.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I remember this.
Who was at the trailer with Kayleen?
She was the one who survived, even though she was severely injured and she managed to get help.
That's right, despite having her trachea severed.
Wow.
Crystal showed incredible courage and determination, crawling to a neighbor's house to get help.
Wow.
And she was able to provide a description of Sells to the police, which ultimately led to his arrest.
That's incredible. What a story. She's a true survivor.
She is, and her testimony was crucial in convicting Sells for the murder of 9-year-old Mary Beatrice Perez
Oh, okay.
from earlier that year.
So wait, he was only convicted of one murder?
Yes, despite all of the confessions and all of the confirmed victims, he was only officially convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of Mary Beatrice Perez.
Well, it's better than nothing, I guess.
It is, and it's important to remember that Crystal's bravery played a very significant role in bringing him to justice.
Right.
Her survival and testimony meant that he couldn't continue his reign of terror.
Yeah, I think her story really speaks to the resilience of the human spirit,
Absolutely.
especially in the face of such unimaginable horror.
It does, but even with his arrest and conviction, the ambiguity of his case remained.
Right, because he was executed in 2014, but those lingering questions about the other victims still remain.
They do, and that's what makes the case of Tommy Lynn Sells so fascinating, so disturbing, and ultimately so unsettling.
Yeah, it really is unsettling. And, as we've been talking about all of this, I keep thinking about those families who are still out there searching for answers,
Yeah.
wondering if their missing loved one was one of Sells' victims. That lack of closure has got to be just agonizing.
It is. It really highlights the ripple effect of these crimes.
Right,
The violence doesn't just end with the victim,
right.
It spreads outward, impacting families, communities, even the people who are involved in investigating these cases.
Right.
The trauma can linger for years, even decades.
Absolutely. It makes you realize that cases like this are about so much more than just catching the killer.
Right.
There's this whole human cost that we can't forget.
Exactly. And it speaks to the importance of support systems for victims' families
Yeah.
and the need for ongoing investigation into these cold cases.
Right.
We owe it to the victims and their families to keep searching for those answers,
Yeah.
to keep working towards some sense of resolution, even if it's years later.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and crimes of Tommy Lynn Sells,
Yeah.
what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listener will walk away with?
Well, I think this case really underscores the complexity of human behavior.
Yeah.
How someone can be capable of such horrific acts? It's a question that continues to fascinate and haunt us.
Right.
And it also reinforces the devastating impact of childhood trauma
Yeah.
and the need for early intervention and support for, people who have experienced that kind of abuse.
And I think it also highlights the challenges that law enforcement face when they're dealing with serial killers who cross state lines.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine trying to track someone like Sells, who was constantly on the move,
Yeah.
leaving a trail of violence all across the country.
It's a logistical nightmare. It
Yeah.
really emphasizes the need for, better communication and collaboration between agencies.
For sure. And, even though this has been a really dark and disturbing deep dive,
Right.
I think it's important to remember that there are stories of hope and resilience woven into this narrative as well.
You're absolutely right. We can't forget about Crystal Searles and her incredible bravery.
Right.
Her story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of situations, the human spirit can prevail.
Yeah, it's a testament to the strength of the human will to survive,
Yeah.
to overcome even the most unimaginable trauma.
Absolutely.
And her willingness to testify against Sells played a crucial role in stopping him
Right.
and ensuring justice for at least one of his victims.
Absolutely. So yes, this is a story about a serial killer and his crimes.
Yeah.
But it's also a story about the resilience of the human spirit
Right.
and the importance of continuing to fight for justice, even when the odds seem insurmountable.
That's a powerful message to end on. So for our listener out there, if you're interested in exploring more true crime cases and learning about the psychology behind these kinds of horrific acts, I encourage you to do some digging. There are so many resources available, and it's a topic that deserves our attention and our continued efforts to understand and prevent this violence from happening in the future.
And as you delve into these cases, remember the victims and their families. Their stories matter, and their pain deserves to be acknowledged and honored.